Clojure syntax. Now the first thing you'll notice when you're learning Clojure is that there are a ton of parentheses. A ton. They're everywhere. A lot of them. And I think one of the weird things to people is that they're around things. They're not like inside. Everything is surrounded by parentheses. You might be used to languages that don't use parentheses in the same way, and so it looks a little foreign. In fact, you're probably very used to that. You're used to using a C-style syntax or JavaScript, C, JavaScript, Java. They all have very similar syntaxes. But here's the thing. Syntax is like the least important thing about programming. It's important because you need to get your code past the interpreter or the compiler. It needs to be valid code. It needs to work. But in terms of what a programmer does and the kinds of things that the programmer builds, the syntax is just the language that you're talking to. The syntax is like the least important part of that. It's like the first chapter of the book when you're learning a new language. And usually they just have that for a reference. What is important is the semantics. Semantics is like what the program does, what the language does, what the syntax means. Semantics means meaning. So it's a bit like this. If I asked you to read Chinese, assuming you don't know Chinese, maybe you do, but if I asked you to read Chinese, you might tell me, well, this looks funny, I don't understand it, it's different. And yes, it's different, but eventually you learn Chinese, if you study hard or whatever, and then you can read it. And there's different systems. It's a different symbol system for representing language. So what is important? It's the semantics, the meaning behind it. And there's a lot of meaning in Chinese literature. And that's what you're really after as a programmer. So what, Chinese and, the Latin alphabet, they have totally different systems. And now as programmers, we get to choose that system. I mean, these things are designed. They're not evolved over time. And we can make them however we want. So how do we choose something that is not important? Right, or is way less important than something else? Well, in Lisp, the choice was made, since it wasn't important, to do something very simple and easy and just get out of the way. Right, the parsing of Lisp is so easy. So actually, when they made Fortran, when parsing was really hard to do, a lot of the theory hadn't been developed, and the techniques hadn't been developed, and then computers were had much less memory and less processing power, so parsing was actually hard, and they had to make a lot of compromises just to fit everything in memory. So it actually took something like 40 man-years to make the Fortran compiler, and at the same time it took a couple of grad students a short amount of time, I'm thinking weeks, to write the parser for Lisp. At most weeks. It's so easy to write. Everything is so clear and consistent, because the parsing is like the very first step. It's called, in Lisp it was called reading. And you would just read these these data structures in, and then you would interpret it later. They called it evaluating. And so it means that as a syntax, it's very easy and regular. There aren't a lot of corner cases or edge cases. It's just very simple. And it's so simple that the parentheses don't even matter. Now it has a bunch of, I'll go through them. So when you're doing Lisp, one thing people say is that the parentheses disappear. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean that they're not looking at the parentheses. They've got a lot of help from their editor to balance the parentheses. Parentheses are still significant, they mean something, but what they mean is so regular that they can ignore them. Because what they mean is, look at the first thing in the parentheses, and that determines the meaning of the rest. So you would do an if statement, you do open paren, and you write if, space. And then you have the condition, the then statement, and the else statement. So the if tells you that the next thing is the condition, the next thing after that is the then, and the next thing after that is the else. So what's important to read, when your eyes are scanning, what's important is to find the if. The let form for making local variables, local names. You open paren, you put let. And that tells you how to interpret the rest of the thing. You're going to have your binding form and and then the body of the let, where you can actually use the variables. So it's so regular and so easy to parse that your brain just forgets about them. They're not important. They're not important. They're important for parsing, and they're totally unambiguous about how they balance, which is another nice property. Let's go through the nice properties. One is that when you have a balanced statement with parens, the indentation is totally mechanical. Like, you can just have your editor do it for you, your code editor. That's so nice. White space is not significant. I mean, you need white space between things, like between two words, two variables. Otherwise, it looks like one variable. But the indentation, how much white space do you have at the beginning of the line, that is totally determined mechanistically. There are a couple different styles. Different people have different styles, but they can just set their editor up the way they like, and then it can do it for them. Another thing is you can have your editor help you balance those parentheses. Right? So I use something called pair edit, and pair edit will always keep your parens and other braces, so square braces, curly braces, it'll keep those all balanced all the time. So if you type an open, it's going to put the closed, but then it won't let you delete the closed, because that you would need to delete the open, right? So if you delete the open, it deletes the closed if it's empty. So it's a really nice system. It takes a lot of getting used to, because you're like, I want to type here and I can't because there's a paren there. But what you learn to do is to move your paren. So like you do what's called slurp, and you slurp one thing into your paren. You can slurp again and slurp it again, and so that form inside the paren keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you can barf stuff out too. You can also lift something out, so you just like put your cursor on something and just say, I just want this, everything else can just go away. You can split, so you're in the middle of a paren of a form, you split into two right at the cursor. Really useful stuff. Okay, so that was two things. Another thing is that you could easily write a parser for it, so it has editor support really quickly. That's really not so useful nowadays because people are like using existing parsers for their syntax, but it's still important. Right. So that means that tooling can use you can write your own tools for the language pretty easily. I don't know of any other benefits besides those. Just that it's super simple, gets you out of the way, and lets you start working. Yeah, so I'm trying to do these more often, so please subscribe and you'll get more little tidbits like this.